Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Director Denise O'Donnell at the Bureau of Justice Assistance, let me welcome you to the webinar on body-worn camera policy development as part of the Bureau's ongoing technical assistance program for body-worn cameras. My name is Denise Rodriguez. I'm a research scientist at CNA, and I'm also the project manager of technical assistance for BJA's body-worn camera PA program. And I will provide a brief introduction for today's webinar. So today's webinar focuses on a very important issue for the body-worn camera pilot implementation program sites and for any agencies implementing body-worn cameras. Before we start the webinar, there are two important points on body-worn camera policy development that should be made. The policy development process for body-worn camera programs is critically important. It basically sets the tone for how things will go with body-worn cameras. It is that very important formal first step that influences the implementation process. Policy development itself is a process. Policies change based on experience and external factors such as legislation or changes in equipment technology. So we are, or should be, constantly assessing our body-worn camera policies to ensure that they are contemporary and actually helpful. The second point, under BJA's procedures, body-worn camera policies must be approved by the Bureau in order for the bulk of the awarded funds to be released. And many of you have been through this process with us. So today's webinar will cover a few topics that we think are very vital to body-worn camera policy development. Most importantly, we will hear from our partners at Arizona State University regarding their observations of the policy development process for body-worn cameras and some of the research they've done on various policy topics. Today we will hear from Professors Michael White and Charles Katz from ASU. We want to thank them for working with us to put this webinar together and for their participation today. This is another in a series of webinars sponsored by the Bureau of Justice Assistance and coordinated by CNA for the Body-Worn Camera Technical Assistance Program. Again, we thank the Bureau of Justice Assistance for its investment in the Body-Worn Camera Grant Program, the Body-Worn Camera Toolkit, and in a range of technical assistance resources and opportunities for agencies implementing body-worn cameras. The Bureau supports state, county, local, and tribal law enforcement agencies in many, many ways, and we are grateful that they do. Before we continue, I'm going to pass this off to Dominique, our outreach coordinator for this project. She's going to go over some of the technical aspects of the webinar.
Thanks, Denise. This webinar is recorded for the benefit of others who may view it later on our website. There will be opportunities for questions and participation during the webinar, so please make sure your thoughts and questions are known. I can assure you that others will appreciate hearing what you have to say. If you don't get a chance to voice your comments or questions, please use the chat utility to the right of your screen, and we'll do our best to respond to your input. Following the webinar, you will receive a request to evaluate it. Please complete the evaluation, and please give us your honest opinions and thoughts, as well as recommendations. And also let us know what other topics you'd like for us to cover in future webinars.
All right, thank you, Dominique. Mike White, all yours.
Okay, thanks, Denise. Thanks, Dominique. Again, this is Mike White. I'm a professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at ASU, and I'm co-director of training and technical assistance for BJA's body-worn camera program. I have two partners in crime, Dr. Charles Katz, also from ASU, and Jessica Herbert, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. She's a graduate student now of ours, and she is in class. Just to give you a brief overview of what we're going to cover over the next 45 to 50 minutes, there are two parts to the presentation we're going to do, and if you take away anything from this webinar, take away this one point, and Denise already hit on this. Administrative policy is critically important for a healthy and effective body-worn camera program. And that's really the key message that we're going to try to convey today. As I said, there are two parts to the presentation. I'm going to handle the first part, which is more of a high-level discussion of policy. I want to start off just by talking a little bit about the importance of policy generally for the police, and then I'll transition and talk about body-worn camera policy and some of the resources that are out there, because that's an important point to recognize. If you're going down this road, you don't have to do it alone. There are many resources out there you can draw on to help you devise your policy. And then, of course, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about BJA's what I call the PIT program, Policy and Implementation Program. It's their body-worn camera funding program, we've devised a policy review process, and we've created a scorecard that we use as part of that process. And that scorecard is available for anyone who would like to use it to assess the comprehensiveness of their policy. At that point, after I go through all that, we'll take a quick break, if you will, and if any questions have been posed, we can try to answer those. And then I'll turn it over for the last half of the presentation to Dr. Katz. One of the things that we've been doing is that since we're working with that first group of awardees, agencies that got funding, we've been analyzing their administrative policies, and we've analyzed over 50 body-worn camera policies to date. So Dr. Katz is going to spend some time walking through some of the variation that we're seeing in policies on some of the really important key issues. So with that, let's dive right in. And like I said, I want to start simply by taking a step back and talking about the importance of policy in general for the police. And you know, we're academics, and you know, we rarely deal in certainties. So if you hear an academic or a professor speak, we often talk about, you know, hypotheses or associations or positive negative relationships. Rarely do we talk about anything with you know, a degree of certainty. And this is one of those exceptions. This is one of those areas where we can talk in terms of near certainty. And what I mean is that administrative policy can effectively guide and control officer decision-making and behavior in the field if three conditions are met, and those three conditions are on this slide. The first of those conditions is that the policy has to be clear. So it has to be very, very clear to the officer when he or she reads the policy what is permissible, what is expected of them, and what is not permissible. The second, obviously, and related to that, is that the policy has to be available, of course, to the officers and understood. And I'm not talking about when there's a new policy you hand it out to all the officers at roll call and you pat them on the back and say, let me know if you have any questions. The policy must be explained. There should be training involved, perhaps even scenario-based training, to make sure that everyone understands what is expected of them with this new policy. And then the third piece is that the policy has to be enforced. There has to be some sort of supervisory review of officers. If there are violations of a policy, they need to be addressed. And that could be through any number of ways, the kind of hallway conversations or more informal coaching. But if the violations are persistent, if the violations last over time and they're serious, then obviously there needs to be, you know, perhaps a more formal response, even moving into graduated discipline. And the idea here is that officers understand that if they violate the policy knowingly or even intentionally, that they're going to be unintentionally, they're going to be asked to answer that. So these are the three conditions that have to be met. And dare I say, we could even use the F word. The F word here being fact. If these three conditions are met, it is near fact that officers will respond and follow the policy. And I can say that because I've got lots of evidence to back up that statement. We have, you know, data and evidence across a wide range of police issues that support this point, particularly with regard to force. We have probably 3 decades now of deadly force research that shows how important administrative policy is in this area and how it can change officer shooting behavior. We've also seen research looking at lesser forms of force, physical force, use of the taser, things like that. And similarly important findings have come in other areas such as pursuits, whether they be auto or foot pursuits, as well as different kind of police responses, use of canines and even officer responses in domestic violence calls. So the bottom line is that we know that policy is important. We know that policy can lead to positive behavior among officers, and it's this body of evidence that provides the backdrop or the foundation of everything we're talking about with regard to body-worn camera policy. And, you know, of course, it's no secret that policy is important and that policy can affect officer behavior in positive ways. You see on this slide a long list of people who would be counted as proponents of administrative policy, from IACP and PERF to to the ABA and ACLU. So lots of different organizations. If you're familiar at all with the process the Civil Rights Division uses during its investigations and potential consent decrees, a key component of what they focus on is administrative policy. And I include, a nod here to CALIA, and I think most of us are probably familiar with CALIA and the process that an agency goes through with accreditation, and clearly there are some limitations to the process, but I also think we can stand up CALIA as kind of a clear recognition of the importance of policy for effectively managing officers and effectively achieving, as the quote would say, your administrative and operational goals. So as we transition a little bit here now and talk about policy in the area of body-worn cameras and why policy is important, everything I just said applies to the area of body-worn cameras as well. But there are a couple of other issues that I think are somewhat unique for body-worn cameras. Certainly, a good policy will include, upfront the goals or the mission, and that's a way for the leadership to communicate to the line officers what the goals are, what the department is trying to accomplish with its body-worn camera program. It conveys expectations to officers. And I think this is really important because there needs to be a recognition that the officers who are on the street who are going to be wearing the cameras, they need to have an understanding of the origins of the program and why they're being asked to do this. The policy development process, we believe, is also absolutely critical. And one of the reasons I think it's critical is because of the opportunity it provides for collaboration. So you'll see I'd say allows for internal and external collaboration. I think it's fair to say that a body-worn camera program touches every single unit in a law enforcement agency, and there can be resistance from certain elements of or parts of an organization. One really effective way to overcome resistance is to bring everyone in at the start. Engage with all the relevant units, engage with the union, with line officers, with first-line supervisors, with patrol commanders, with IA, with certainly the IT folks. Bring everyone in the beginning. Allow them to ask questions, answer their questions, allow them to express their concerns. And you want to do the same thing with your external stakeholders as well. Advocacy groups, your community leaders, maybe your faith leaders, certainly your downstream criminal justice actors like prosecutors and the defense bar. Obviously, that's going to provide for a lot of transparency as well. And like I said, when you have that kind of collaborative process along the way, when you're developing your policy, it seems pretty logical that you're going to have greater buy-in and less resistance down the road. And of course, the last two bullets really deal with some of the things I was talking about previously in terms of guiding behavior and providing for accountability. As I said, as agencies move down the body-worn camera road, they don't need to go it alone. There's a significant amount of resources out there to draw on to help you make decisions with regard to specific policy issues. And I just want to spend a little bit of time walking through those. I think a really good place to start are the two reports on this slide. Both came out in 2014. The one on the right, the Assessing the Evidence report, is more of a 30,000-foot view of the issues that are involved and what the evidence tells us about those issues. The COPS PERF report for this particular area, this policy area, I think is more important because it provides a discussion about specific policy issues and actually offers recommendations on, based on their expertise and their review of the evidence, what a policy should say for a specific issue. So those are really two important places to start. The other resource, and I talk about this every single chance I get, is BJA's National Body-Worn Camera Toolkit. The toolkit's a website. You see the link there. It's been operational now for well over a year. And it's a place that houses what I guess I'll call the latest and greatest of what we know on body-worn cameras. And you can see the wide range of issues that are covered. It's a place where anyone can go to learn about this technology, whether you're a chief of police, a civil rights attorney, a prosecutor, a housing authority employee, or even a concerned citizen. And I also think it's important to recognize how this toolkit was created, because it wasn't, two academics huddled in their offices putting this together. The start of the toolkit actually can be traced back to a few months before, when BJA hosted what they called an expert panel at the White House. They invited over 100 really smart people from a wide range of disciplines. We all came together. They locked us in a room for 2 days, and we had a giant brainstorming session about all of the issues that are involved, with this technology. And then Dr. Katz and myself spent the next several months with BJA taking the information that was gleaned from that expert panel and using that to start to build the content of the toolkit. And central to the toolkit is this issue of administrative policy. Just a couple of quick slides on the toolkit. This is what the toolkit looks like. I will say it's very user-friendly. It's basically an FAQ format. It's got lots of, with regard to policy, it has lots of documents, reports. It also has a significant number of administrative policies from different agencies, so you can scroll down, and if you want to look at the Las Vegas Metro policy, it's there, and you can open it up and take a look. The other thing that's, I think, really valuable about the toolkit is the podcast series, and they have several dozen podcasts now loaded onto the toolkit, and basically these are anywhere from 5 to 20 minutes or so, and it's a subject matter expert being interviewed on some topic related to body-worn cameras. And you can see on the right down there, they're categorized by type. So if you're just interested in policy, you could focus on those. You could focus on privacy, whatever you're interested in. And I think the podcast really provides some substance to some of the issues. You can hear a real live human being who's involved in this talk about his or her experiences with regard to some of these issues. This is the web page for the policy resources, and that's Damon Mosler, who's a deputy DA in San Diego County. And again, this is where you want to start in terms of looking at the documents and the resources that are available. And then we also created a law enforcement implementation checklist. This is, I think, a useful tool for an agency that's just starting out. Basically, it's intended to be a roadmap that would take you from point A to point Z in terms of your body-worn camera program. And as you look through that, you'll see how critically central administrative policy is to this implementation. And I should say, for agencies that are already down the road with this technology, they can use this to look back and see if there are things that they didn't do that maybe they should have, and can they go back and address some of those issues. I just want to mention a few other resources that are out there for body-worn camera policy. IACP has a model policy, as does ACLU. These are useful documents just to read, to get a sense of where particular agencies or organizations are coming down on the key points in a policy. Obviously, policy in body-worn cameras is a central feature of the President's Task Force report. And I like to put the NIJ market survey on this slide because a colleague told me there are now more than 50 vendors that are in this market, which makes procurement sometimes overwhelming. And this NIJ market survey, what it does is it compares some of the vendors on some key characteristics, and it can be a good starting point for the procurement process, because in some ways the policy issues that you're going to deal with in your administrative policy may be determined to some extent by which vendor you go with. And the last thing I want to do before I turn it over to Dr. Katz is just talk a little bit about the PIP program, the funding program run by BJA. And For those of you on the webinar who are representing a PIP site, this is probably something you already know. But for those not involved in the program, you may recall back in December of 2014, President Obama gave a speech in the Rose Garden, and this was after a very difficult summer. The death of Eric Garner, the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, a couple of other cases, and the president, he did a number of things during this speech, one of which was announcing the president's task force, the creation of that task force. But the other thing he did is he pledged $75 million for up to 50,000 body-worn cameras. And the PIP program is the realization of that promise from the president. And last year, in 2015, BJA gave over $19 million in awards to more than 70 agencies. And those agencies now, these are 2-year grants, and these agencies are, they're finishing up year 1 of their grant. And then I would think in the next couple of weeks, the 2016 awards are going to be announced, and rumors are suggesting that there could be upwards of 100 or more new agencies that come on board. The other thing that BJA did is they created this training and technical assistance team, this support system for grantees, and that's the team that provides a wide range of services that you see on the slide, and administrative policy review I'm going to talk about in a minute. That's a really big piece of what we do. But CNA, ASU, and Craig Uchida at JSS, we're the team that works together to provide that support for funded agencies. And I will say that, our mandate is to provide that support for whoever asks. So if we're contacted by an agency that has not received funding through this program, but they would like assistance with body-worn camera issues, particularly with administrative policy, we help. We will provide that assistance. So that's an important thing to recognize. The other point with regard to policy is it was very clear from the start that BJA wanted to ground this funding program in the importance of policy. So what they did to reinforce that is they structured the program in a way that when an agency gets a grant, they can access 10% of their funds immediately, but they can't access the remaining 90% until they submit their administrative policy to the TTA team, to us. We then review the policy, and we work with the agency to go through this process. We've created what we call a policy review scorecard. I'll show you that in a minute. And basically, this is an iterative process between the TTA team and the agency to address the comprehensiveness of the policy to get it to where it needs to be, so that BJA will approve the policy and then release the remainder of the fund. And the key here is that the assessment that is done of the policy is about comprehensiveness. And we've had a number of policies come in that are approved immediately because they check all the boxes, if you will, and then we've had many where there's more of, like I said, that back and forth process. The scorecard that we've devised, we created it based on, the latest and greatest of what's out there on body-worn cameras, the most recent research and evidence, the PERF report, the toolkit. And basically what the scorecard does is it rates the comprehensiveness of a body-worn camera policy across 11 different policy areas. And there are 45 specific issues covered in those 11 areas. So what you see on this slide is the policy development area. And you'll notice that several are in red, and BJA decided that 17 of the 45 issues are of such importance that they are mandatory. They need to be covered in the policy. And for an agency that's going through this policy review process as part of the PIP program, they need to score an 80% or higher to be recommended for approval. And I believe that's 36 out of 45. So it doesn't have to be perfect, except with regard to the mandatory issues. You have to be 17 out of 17 on those. And let me be clear about this, because a couple of weeks ago there was another scorecard that was released that was very different from ours. We do not propose any sort of directionality. Our scorecard is not prescriptive at all. It simply rates comprehensiveness. I'll give you an example to illustrate. One of the issues that it is important for a policy to address is citizen advisement or notification should officers tell the citizen that he or she is being reported. So in our scorecard, we simply have the language, does the policy provide officers with guidance about citizen notification, yes or no? We don't dictate what that guidance should be. We simply are assessing whether or not information is in the policy that provides guidance to the officer. So comprehensiveness only. And here are the 11 policy areas and the 45 specific issues, the 17 mandatory items, all fall within these 11 different areas. And you can see that this, this covers pretty much everything from the policy development process to ongoing policy and program review or evaluation. And, because our process is not prescriptive, it's about comprehensiveness, we get to see lots of variation in policies from agencies. And that's my little segue into what Dr. Katz is going to talk about, because he has been specifically looking at some of the variation in the issues, the 45 issues, for example, that are covered in these policy areas. But before I turn it over to Dr. Katz, this is the point where we wanted to stop and see if anyone has any questions about anything that I've covered so far. I don't see any questions in the chat box. Dominique or Denise, have we gotten any other questions?
Not yet on our end.
Okay, this is the first week of class for ASU, so we're used to silence and blank stares from our students. But I think at this point, what I'll do is I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Katz, and I'm going to transfer over control of the slides. And Dr. Katz, it's all yours.
Great, thank you. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Over the past several months, we've taken a lot of time and deliberate action in terms of trying to understand the types, comprehensiveness, direction of policies that have been created and implemented as part of agencies' deployment of body-worn cameras. We, last April, at our national conference, we took a real initial slice of the data that we were able to extract. It was from about 27 different agencies who had completed it by April. Apologize for the sniffles up front. My allergies are getting to me. But we wanted to look at a couple of issues in terms of processes and operation. And we looked at a number of issues, like officer notification of body cameras, circumstances involving activation, deactivation, when an officer can review their media, and the such. And we started to, as we unpeeled this information, we started to learn a lot about it. For example, when it came to officer notification, we found that in some ways it was not related. The department's requirements were not related to state legislation. For example, a number of states have one-party or two-party laws which require an officer to notify the public when a body camera is being used if it's a two-party state. So for example, if it's a two-party state, the citizen that the officer is making contact with has to approve the use of body camera to be recorded, as well as the officer. And we found that there was really very little correlation between what state legislation was and what agencies' policies were, in large part due to problem solving on the part of legislators as well as police agencies in terms of how to address those issues. And we learned that there were a number of strategies that were used in an effort to get body cameras out in the field. And with our talk today, what we wanted to do is take some things a step further and look at a number of other different communities, adding them to our analysis. As of July, we had received policies from 50 law enforcement agencies that had received funding and that were in 26 different states. And you'll see that it's a number of major metropolitan areas. We have some smaller communities, but these are really major municipalities that have implemented body-worn cameras: San Francisco, Sacramento, Philadelphia, Phoenix, and the such. And so this is a depiction of large agencies, and we're moving forward with some smaller communities, and you'll see some smaller communities that are included as well here, and more of those will be forthcoming as we're going to be looking at differences between smaller agencies and larger agencies. For this analysis, we looked at 5 core areas: policies relating to officer activation, policies related to officer deactivation, officer review of the media, supervisory review, as well as data retention.
Hey, is the under down there? Okay, I'll shoot it. Thanks, bye.
When we were looking at officer activation and deactivation, we looked at issues related to mandatory, discretionary, restrictive behavior, or policies related to behavior. When we were looking at officer review and supervisory review, we were looking at when are officers and supervisors permitted to review the media, whether it was related to training, performance, or related to work-related activity in the form of reports, criminal investigations, use in court, and the such. And then with retention, we were really trying to understand how long some of this footage had to be kept, and we wanted to assess how in line it was with different stakeholders' recommendations related to the retention of data, as pointed out by Dr. White. And we wanted to see what were actually people doing versus what some of these different groups have recommended. Now, with activation and deactivation, for those of you that are familiar with Samuel Walker, Jeff Alpert's work on deadly force, pursuit driving, what we wanted to do was take a look at how policies were created and established based on this idea of confined discretion, meaning that different agencies are probably going to use different methods for controlling officer discretion. In the literature, it's typically been broken up in terms of mandatory, things that are mandatory to do, some things that are discretionary or officers are permitted to do when certain conditions exist, as well as giving restrictions. And as an example, we can look at deadly force, right? When certain conditions are there, for example, when there is a threat to the safety of the officer or another, an officer is permitted to use deadly force. But it's restrictive. These policies are restrictive in the sense that a officer is not permitted to use deadly force to an unarmed fleeing felon, as perhaps they had decades ago. So it not only provides discretion or allows for the conditions in which an officer is permitted to use deadly force, but it also informs them about when they're not permitted to use deadly force. And so we wanted to take a similar look at these issues. Our first review, you'll see in terms of officer activation and officer deactivation, you'll see that there is a substantial amount of variety in terms of how agencies are framing their policy. You'll see with regard to activation that the majority of agencies are including policies or developing policies that tell an officer when they're required to turn it on, when they have discretion, and discretion. And let me give you an example of mandatory activation. Mandatory activation in some communities is built in when you receive a call for service. It can be when there is self-initiated activity, situations that are going to call for an arrest or use of force. These are circumstances when officers, according to policy, are mandated to activate their cameras. Discretionary situations can be a little bit different. For example, in some communities, special units have a substantial amount of discretion on when determining to activate their camera in the field. For example, SWAT operations and the such. It oftentimes can be left to the discretion of a supervisor, a commander, or the what. And then we also had a fair amount of agencies that did focus on restricting activation. Right? Examples of this would be that you're restricted from using the body-worn camera in certain locations, locker rooms, bathrooms, when there is a privileged conversation going on with an attorney, when you're speaking with friends or on personal issues, your spouse, labor representatives, ministers. And what you see here is that the two primary frameworks in which agencies have used to, with regard to creating policy related to activation, has been either using all three categories or a more balanced approach that has, mandatory activation, restrictive activation, as well as providing some discretion for officers. And then you also have some that do not offer, a large number of agencies that don't offer the opportunity for officers to deploy it with any discretion. It's simply you're told when you are required to turn it on, when you're mandated to, or when you are restricted, not allowed to have it activated. And so we're seeing really a couple of different directions there, and we're going to be paying close attention to how this evolves in the future. We next looked at officer deactivation. There was a lot more variety here. You can see that the vast majority of agencies had a policy of mandatorily when to turn it off, as well as discretion in terms of when to turn it off. Mandatory deactivation might look something like this, that when the officer is not disengaged, the officer shall not disengage the body-worn camera until the entire incident has been recorded, or when further recording of the incident will not serve a proper police service. Right? They give very explicit directions on when the body camera is to be deactivated. Discretionary is a little bit different. It often provides a lot more opportunity for interpretation by the officer, oftentimes uses language such as when the officer has a reasonable belief that there will be no loss of critical information or documentation. For example, they could turn it off when they're filling out reports, when there's nothing going on at a scene, when they believe that just nothing of value is going to be recorded. And then there were some agencies that restricted deactivation, right? You are not permitted to turn it on. It cannot be terminated until a certain situation arises, such as the sergeant has informed the officer of when they can turn it off, or that they can turn it off. When the incident has wholly ended is when you can turn it off, and the such. We also looked at officer review. There has been a lot of discussion lately about, is an officer permitted to review their own body camera footage, for example, before they write the report, or immediately following an incident, or down the road when they're looking at their own activity. And we wanted to examine how this fell out in terms of sort of official responsibilities as determined by report writing, criminal investigations, court preparation. And then we also wanted to look at it in terms of internal uses. For example, the officer or their supervisor may want to use it for performance-related issues and training, or it could be used for administrative investigations to look at issues that have arisen in the field. And what you see is that the vast majority of agencies permit viewing, the officers to view their material for official responsibilities related to report writing, investigations, court preparation. While sometimes it requires some approval from somebody, they're permitted to use it. When we talk about allowing viewing with conditions, which you see there in the second row, what we're talking about is sometimes an officer will have to request to review video from their sergeant in an appropriate time. So you just have to request the assistance of the supervisor. Other times it will allow field training officers to examine officers' footage for training purposes. So in other words, when we're looking at performance-related activities, oftentimes, or typically they're permitted to view it unrestricted, or at least with some conditions. Once we start getting into more internal purposes with regard to administrative investigations, things start to change a little bit, and that it's no longer as wide open as you see when it's being used for reports and criminal investigation, and that it's fairly split in terms of allowing open-ended viewing by the officer or allowing viewing with conditions, and there's some that actually restrict the viewing of the material. When we're talking about investigations, policies oftentimes read something like, upon advisement that the officer is the subject of or witness to an internal or criminal investigation or complaint, the officer can no longer view the body-worn camera video of the event in question unless expressly authorized by internal affairs or the shift lieutenant or designee if the investigation or inquiry is being conducted in the chain of command, or a designee if the investigation is being conducted by the chain of command. So in other words, they're permitted to do it, but it's conditionally based upon the approval of the investigating entity or person. And other agencies, it's a little bit more specific in that it can be done in if you're in the presence of the officer's labor representative or attorney, but there's pretty tight conditions placed on when the officer can review those materials. And we're going to start breaking that down a little bit more, especially as more policies come in. With respect to supervisory review, you see here that roughly 37 of the 50 agencies allow supervisors to review it at will, the body-worn camera footage at will. About 12 of them, if certain conditions are present, they can view them with respect to training, and it restricts, in 5 of the agencies, they're restricted from viewing the footage for performance and training-related issues. When it comes to compliance, most agencies allow the supervisors to examine body-worn camera footage, and also with respect to critical incidents and administrative hearings, supervisors are permitted to review the material. A lot of agencies we found permit supervisors to review body camera footage through random audits. And so there will be, for example, 10 calls for service that will be pulled up. They'll determine if body camera footage was activated or whether the body-worn camera was activated, and determine whether or not the officer used the body camera in the way in which it was supposed to be used in the field. When we're talking about restricted viewing, in a number of agencies, you see that it requires that there be a supervisory or a more formal reason for initiating examining the body-worn camera, such as when a disciplinary inquiry is moving forward against the employee, or there's a problem there's a problem by the supervisor identified, and they want to examine the issue further. But other agencies require that a supervisor is not permitted to review body-worn camera footage unless it is approved by their own supervisor or by another organization. So they're trying to place a check on supervisors from randomly reviewing body-worn camera footage. And so we're seeing quite a bit of difference here, really depending upon the circumstances, as well as the different steps in terms of approval that are required to be obtained before a supervisor can obtain or review the body-worn camera footage. Data retention. Data retention, we think, is one of the more interesting issues that we came across. What we found was that it was fairly complex and difficult to assess with most of the agencies to determine how long they were required to retain their data. We found that 3 of the agencies don't address it whatsoever. Right? They didn't refer to or consider issues related to data retention. 14 of the agencies made reference to an other agency or policy or state legislation. This makes it a little bit tougher in terms of trying to identify and track these issues down, whether it's for the officer, and these need to be covered in training issues or training programs, or whether or not officers need to go to state legislative mandates and take a look at those issues. But a lot of agencies you see here simply had a statement that read as follows: the retention period and purging guidelines for body-worn camera recordings shall be in accordance with the guidelines set forth by blank agency. It doesn't necessarily have to be the police agency, but typically it's a state-level organization. Others will include language such as the retention period shall not be less than 30 days and shall be subject to the following additional retention periods based on what state legislation may state. Within 16, or about a third of body-worn camera policies, we found that this was expressly stated within policy. It was clear. It was easy for officers to identify what the policy was so that they had a better understanding of some of their own obligations in terms of being required to flag incidents if they believe that it needed to be flagged. And you see in 17 of the agencies, or about a third, policy with respect to data retention was mentioned within the department, or was mentioned within another agency's policy or state legislation. So in terms of key takeaways, we wanted to focus on 4 basic issues. One was related to officer activation and deactivation. Confined discretion is a theme throughout the majority of the policies. We would articulate that we would like to see comprehensive policies policies that articulate when a camera should be turned on, when an officer should be, when a camera should be deactivated, or when they should not be turned on, or when they cannot be deactivated, as well as providing some discretion for officer usage in the field. An example of that was when a witness does not want to be, their identity does not want to be on film or on media and the such. Officer review. All agencies allow officers to use their recorded media to examine their own performance and duties. Most of them allow it to be used for training, but what's interesting here is that we're not quite seeing the level of detail here with respect to its availability for use for training. There was not a lot of explicit language used there in terms of the steps that were required for video to be used in a training program, whether it has to obtain the officer's permission, some of those types of issues. In terms of supervisory review, we found that there were some gaps in that exist in supervisors' use and review of their own video when involved in administrative or critical incidents. As many of you know, there's oftentimes a requirement for a supervisor to show up at a critical incident, but a number of the policies did not discuss how to deal with their own video, how to move their own video, how to review it. Things typically stopped at the sergeant's level. And with regard to data retention, we found that these policies that were provided and were recorded within their own police department were not as explicit as we would have expected, but oftentimes referred to other state legislation or another agencies within the city government in terms of their policies and procedures. With that, we were hoping to take any questions that you might have, any suggestions that you might have for further analysis and how we might be able to get into some of these issues in a more detailed way.
This is Mike. We did get one question in the chat box, which I'll respond to, and then Chuck can chime in as well while others are collecting their thoughts. The question we got in the chat box is what is our opinion of an amnesty period during initial implementation? And I'm gonna take a guess here at what I think is being asked. Basically, I think this question involves kind of applying a different set of rules during an initial pilot rollout of the cameras. And my view on that is that you need to be very, very careful because this could be a slippery slope. I understand that, you know, in some agencies there will be a fair amount of internal resistance to body-worn cameras, and a amnesty period, if you will, can be an effective way to overcome some of that resistance on certain issues. Certainly one of those issues could be activation. So if during this implementation period you're seeing that certain officers are not activating in calls where they're supposed to, you can use that, you know, kind of amnesty period to work with officers to, you know, to get that buy-in rather than going straight to some sort of graduated discipline. I think you could also use that amnesty period for supervisory review. Many of the concerns that union and line officers will have are about unfettered access by supervisors and fishing expeditions. So you can use that period to demonstrate that supervisors are not permitted to do that. But the question I wonder about is, what are you going to do if you've worked with your union to set up this period of time where the rules are held in abeyance? You have a citizen complaint against an officer who is wearing a camera. Are you going to review the video or not? If you do review the video and you see that the officer actually did engage in inappropriate behavior or inappropriate language, what are you going to do then? So it's tough. I think it can be useful in some respects, but you need to be very, very clear up front. One, that the rules are going to be temporary for this period of time, and two, that you know, once you move out of this pilot phase, that the rules will change, and that a new set of rules is going to apply, and all those things that we talked about early on about the importance of policy, that's when that's all going to come into play.
This is Chuck Katz. I think that this is one of those cases where prior to body-worn cameras being deployed in the field, where you want to educate the community, the media, any sorts of key stakeholders within your community about what to expect. And I think that police leaders need to work their way back over the past 40 years and thinking about how hard it has been to get 100% compliance on serious issues confronting the police. Let me use an example of Miranda warnings. After the Supreme Court ruled in Miranda that all officers were required to read an individual their rights, a number of academics looked at compliance on those issues, and they found that even 3 years later, they were still having a tough time getting the majority of officers to comply with reading individuals their Miranda rights. And I believe, if I recall, it was somewhere around 5 years until the vast majority were complying. And this part had to do with officer resistance. It had to do with the learning curve. It also had to do with turnover among the police department. Some of these that are going to be the most, it's going to be the most difficult to change are officers who have been working for 30 plus years, and all of a sudden we're trying to get them to remember to turn it on, and then also have the muscle memory to turn it on. And so I think that one is we really have to educate the community in terms of that this is not simply an easy button that we can hit and everything is going to magically change. And we need to make sure to put a check on expectations. The second one is I also think that the second issue is the seriousness of the issue and how it can be handled, right? Are we talking about an issue that deals with poor use of language in the field, or are we talking about a serious incident involving the harm of an officer or a suspect or a bystander? And then we're also having to think about a scale in terms of discipline, right? One is whether or not you're going to review it in this period. The other one is how is discipline going to be influenced? It may be that you're going to review everything and examine it the way you normally would, but there may be a sliding scale depending upon the egregiousness of the misconduct by the officer. And right now, we don't have a lot of guidance on that. We did not really see any policies that talked about this sort of phased-in approach, even though it's discussed pretty widely out there.
Yeah, this is Mike. The listener specified a little bit more on what he or she was interested in, and it dealt with the activation early on in the process, and Chuck just covered a lot of that with the learning curve and muscle memory. So I think we both agree that you have to provide some time for that to kind of sink in as a new tool. As Chuck said, for officers that have been on the job for 15, 20 years, this is something that they're not used to having to do. Two things that can be done to help with this. One is, in your policy and in your training, you can recommend strongly that officers activate as soon as they get the call while they're still in the vehicle, rather than waiting until they get there when things may escalate very quickly. And the other is, when do you start training for new officers? And I know some agencies have varied on this. Some have decided not to give new recruits a body-worn camera, feeling that they're overwhelmed already and they don't need just one more thing. And other departments take a different tack. Oakland, for example, gives the body-worn camera on day one along with everything else, so that it does become part of the muscle memory. And I would kind of agree with the Oakland approach that let's get it kind of in the thought process and in the training from day one. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat box. Denise, Dominique, anything come in any other way?
No questions are on our end either.
If questions come up in the next couple of days, we're more than happy to touch base. We're both at Arizona State University, so you can get our our email addresses from ASU's website, or you can put in your request through the TTA website, and we will respond as quickly as we can. So we hope you found that the webinar to be useful, and thank you again for your participation. Take care.